Imagine a world made entirely of shadow. Today, we're diving straight into an incredibly fascinating, grimdark Gothic fable, one that is deeply rooted in Nietzschean philosophy and philology. Welcome to this explainer on the divine monopoly and the friction of the many. Basically, it's a story about a marketplace, a terrified monarch, and the systematic erasure of the human soul. We're going to expose the dark themes of control, spiritual dread, and exactly what happens when someone tries to totally eliminate the messy chaos of life. Let's get right into it. To really grasp this, we first need to set the scene. Think of a marketplace. Historically, this was a vibrant tapestry of life. We're talking a true Dionysian reality, right? 1,000 tongues, chaotic energy, shifting perspectives, just deep organic vitality. But that reality, it's been completely erased. Instead, it was replaced by a sterile, rigid Apollonian illusion, and the reason why is wild. The monarch ruling this land suffered from a crippling spiritual dread of literally anything he didn't outright own. He was absolutely terrified of the unpredictable nature of life itself. So his solution? Trap his citizens in a rigid cage of artificial order. So into this sterile, fake illusion, two internal voices descend to observe things. We'll call them the spirit siblings of truth. First up is the demonic spirit of negation. Imagine it watching through shifting mirrors, whispering cynical knowledge to folks who actually, mistakenly, believe they're at peace. Looking directly at the merchants, the spirit hisses, "You are not citizens. You are merely prisoners of a reflection, dancing on the strings of a monarch's deep insecurity." Wow, right? The people think they're free, but they are really just echoing the hollow anxieties of their king. Then there's the angelic spirit of order. Picture her moving with wings of rigid geometry, her voice grinding like stone. She exposes the sterile shroud of this entire place, declaring, "Every transaction here is a historical fabrication born of fear, a shroud designed to hide the fact that your sovereign was too weak to live alongside anything he did not own." That is such a chilling thought. The very foundation of their daily lives is, literally, just a cover-up for a weak king. Part 1. The Four Parables of Revelation, a descent into the marketplace. Our descent begins with the parable of the singular face. So a merchant once sold masks of 1,000 different gods and heroes. This represented the beautiful, chaotic multiplicity and fragmentation of the human soul. But the monarch, he feared this chaotic multiplicity, so he ordered every single mask burned and replaced with a single likeness, his own face. The merchant actually thought he was achieving perfect, seamless order, but by erasing all the other faces, the vital friction of what philosophy calls the not I, he turned into a motionless heap, just selling hollow echoes in a stall that had absolutely no reason to exist anymore. Next, we have the parable of the painted fruit. A farmer brought his wild, tangled harvest to the square. It was a beautiful Dionysian bloom, rich with local individualities and organic, life-affirming myths. Well, this vibrant life absolutely terrified the monarch. It caused him deep spiritual dread. So he ordered the real fruit replaced with smooth, painted stones. The farmer proudly claimed he had captured eternal beauty. But you know what happened? The bees vanished, and the soil died. The king's desperate need for control literally killed the environment. And this gives us a clear look at the exact timeline of this society's destruction. It all begins with chaotic multiplicity, that vibrant, messy life. But that vibrancy triggers the monarch's fear of the organic, which ultimately results in a silent graveyard. What the farmer and the monarch called order was actually just the systematic cultural castration of life itself. They literally murdered commerce just to soothe the king's anxiety. Moving on to the third story, the parable of the frictionless steel. This one shows the true cost of this forced order on human interaction. Imagine two traders haggling, really enjoying the natural tension of their competing claims. It's the friction of the many. But the monarch viewed this struggle as chaos, even heresy. So he abolished haggling entirely and set a singular absolute price. The result? A forced vacuum. Without the resistance of the not I to provide a limit, the traders couldn't even feel the value of their own goods. Abolishing that friction didn't bring peace. It resulted in complete spiritual suicide. Finally, we arrive at the parable of the burned rival. This perfectly reveals the exact mechanism of Nietzschean slave morality, where weakness disguises itself as virtue. A wealthy baker, suffering from a weak will, just couldn't handle competition. Instead of welcoming the noble struggle of a peer, he gave in to resentment. He branded his neighbor a monstrous abomination and literally burned his shop to the ground. Then, he called his new monopoly good, simply because he erased what he defined as evil. He just wasn't strong enough to have an equal. Part 2. The Spiritually Castrated Soul, Anatomy of a Puppet King's Realm. All of this brings us to a rather terrifying question. What is the true value of a human soul without the friction of the not I? Because, according to this philosophy, the soul actually requires tension to know itself. It has to posit its I by striving against something else. Think about it. You need the earth to resist your step to actually feel your own legs walking, right? Without that resistance, without that pushback, you don't really exist in any meaningful way. So, when the monarch flattens the world into a singular narrative, he doesn't just erase history. He liquidates the individual essence of every single subject into a force vacuum. The soul is no longer a creator. It becomes merely a vessel for resentment. It's a motionless heap in an empty room, a frozen monument to the sovereign's deep insecurity. By removing all the challenges and all the tension, the king essentially dissolves his subjects entirely.
Part 3. Echoes in a Lightless Cage. The siblings' final verdict.
Looking upon this complete emptiness, the angelic spirit delivers a pretty brutal truth. They have accepted the Apollonian mask for a forced vacuum, she declares. She points out that by codifying the piety of their neighbors as heresy, basically by rejecting any friction or difference whatsoever, the people have actively participated in their own spiritual suicide. They sought a world without tension, sure, but what they built was a silent, lightless cage. And then, the demonic spirit of negation cynically wraps up this observation. Truth is found in the friction of the many, the spirit notes, yet they have chosen the hollow silence of the one. These merchants have been entirely assimilated into a narrative they didn't even write. They mistook their freedom from friction for absolute existence, but in reality, they're just monuments to exhaustion, ruling over a totally contextless silence. Which brings us to the ultimate question of this fable. And really, the main takeaway from this whole explainer: will you seek the truth in the friction of the many, embracing the chaotic, difficult tension that gives life its actual value? Or will you trade your soul for the hollow silence of the one? This psychological friction, this push and pull, it matters. It's the very resistance that proves you are alive. Definitely keep that in mind the next time you find yourself wishing for a perfectly frictionless world.